welcome everyone. When Sophie Pavelle was born, the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere was 356.6 parts per million. It's now 416.4 parts per million. And just for context, it should be 350 parts per million to avoid dangerous climate change. A couple of years before Sophie was born, the world agreed to prevent catastrophic climate change and to preserve biological diversity. We're currently at 1 Celsius above pre-industrial levels, heading beyond 2, which is dangerous climate change, and 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction. So Sophie and her generation have a right to be quite angry. But instead, she's channeled her energy into being a zoologist, a science communicator, and an advocate. And we're really lucky to have her here today to talk about her first book, Forget Me Not. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd start with just talking about the narrative of the book. It follows you on your journey around the United Kingdom, looking at 10 species threatened by climate change. And what we can perhaps do to help them and save them. So first of all, why these 10 species?
It's a very good question, because obviously with 1 million species at risk from extinction, there's quite a lot of animals that fit the brief of endangered, overlooked, on the front lines of climate change, native to Britain and the UK. But I wanted species that I didn't know very much about at all. So yes, I have a zoology degree, but that's an incredibly broad understanding of the natural world. You can't understand the natural world in 3 years. And so I wanted to be learning alongside the reader all the way through, because I wanted it to be a kind of friendship throughout the story, where we were learning together and hearing from experts and professors and scientists and passionate people to supplement our gaps in knowledge. And I wanted species that would take me to amazing places around Britain and experience lots of different environments and be accessible by low-carbon transport, which was a key thing for me to try and see if we could do that. And species that represented different taxa, so insects and birds and mammals, and take us into the oceans and up mountains and in grasslands and in towns and things. So it was hard to pick 10 species that did all of that, but I feel pleased that we've kind of put a spotlight on underdog species. You know, there are no puffins, there are no dolphins, and you know they're weird and wonderful, and I've become very fond of them.
Yeah, you can really see you falling in love with them in the chapters. And you mentioned it was green travel, but you also, it's a love letter to Britain as well, and it really inspires you to get out yourself as a reader. To stick with these characters, I noticed you bookended it with insects.
Good.
And which is surprising, because sometimes, you know, it's more difficult to anthropomorphize or get into insects. So why insects?
Well, I mean, insects are disproportionately affected by climate change, and you know, the very bottom of the food chain. So life often begins and ends with those right at the soil, grassroots level. And also they're easy species for us as people to engage with. And so we begin the journey with the marsh fritillary butterfly on Bodmin Moor, and we end it with the bilberry bumblebee up on Dartmoor. And both butterflies and bees are aesthetically very attractive to us as readers and as people. And so I thought, let's, you know, ease us in and ease us out with species that have amazing stories to tell and urgent stories to tell, but ultimately can kind of help frame our way of thinking in favour of them. So we've got 3 insects in the book, just to highlight the fact that they are disproportionately affected, but then also a massive part of the solution as well. You know, if we help insects, and if insects are healthy, in healthy numbers within a habitat, then we can be sure that habitat is going to be more resilient than if their insect numbers are
And I did
fragile.
really enjoy those chapters. You mentioned the marsh fritillary, and I was like looking to see if there were any in Essex, but there's heath fritillaries nearby here, which sound beautiful. And I loved also, you said that, you know, maybe you were suggesting they're a bit easier to find or to spot. But what I loved about this book is that I felt like I could do this, which is not to make you sad, but you know, sometimes when you're reading nature books, it can feel a bit inaccessible.
Yeah.
But it made you think, like, I could get on my bike, I could take a train journey and look for these beautiful species.
Because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
You know, I said, right, I'm going to find these 10 species. I'm not a naturalist. I don't know how to ID wildlife. We don't get taught that in zoology. Certainly where I studied, there was an assumption that you already had that knowledge somewhere, and so here you are to learn a bit more about something else. And that has never really been important to me. For me, it's just the thrill of the chase and just getting outside and the experiential side of it. And I think that's something on a basic level, the joy part of it that we can all connect with, and a long-term relationship with anything starts with joy and emotion. Yeah. And so for me, it wasn't really about whether or not I saw the species, and I didn't really know how to track them down and what field signs to look for. So I was very much a novice, but it ended up being so much more than that.
And that's what carries you along as a reader. Is she going to find one or not? Which is good. And you talked about the emotional journey, but that's really what engages us and makes people care about climate change, isn't it? And makes those figures I talked about at the beginning real. I'll just mention the dung beetle because that's a great chapter as well. We're talking about insects. You can read more about that. But I think one of my favourite chapters was the seagrass, which I really didn't expect. And I knew nothing about, and I'm an environmental journalist. I mean, I knew a little bit about seahorses and the fact they're important to them, but I didn't know about the carbon. About the fact that
Mega.
And your description of diving over them and looking at them was wonderful. Did you have a favourite when you finished?
Oh, I mean, every time I get asked this, it's like trying to choose a favourite child. There are some species that I had a difficult relationship with, like the merlin or the harbour porpoise. But seagrass definitely was really special. I think because I loved how understated it is. It is literally a field of grass underwater, and yet it can bury carbon up to 40 times faster than a pristine tropical rainforest. And it can buffer wave energy to reduce coastal erosion and storm surges around the coastline. It can literally, in the Mediterranean, they're finding that they can bundle microplastics on the shoreline into these kind of coconut-like hairy balls, fibrous balls of plastic to literally prevent it. You're tempted to think of it as like an altruistic way of, oh, thank you, ocean, for saving this plastic.
But agreed.
Yeah, it just so happens to not let it go into the open ocean, and then it provides this nursery for juvenile fish and the whole of the kind of coastal marine food web. And the fact that when you, by description, I was imagining like a kind of a glowing sort of magical grass, and in many ways when the light hits it, it is. At the end of the day, it is just grass under the water. But it has all these astonishing secret properties that can be a huge part of the solution to Britain's climate resilience. And it's a really exciting, it was such a wonderful chance to basically spend a whole chapter profiling an amazing campaign and sort of disaster relief effort to save these meadows around the coastline that have been forgotten for so long.
And the people working on it who haven't had much attention, yet they've been doing something so important. If anyone's around tomorrow, we're talking to Charles. I'm talking to Charles Clover, who's written this book, Rewilding the Oceans. And having read your book, and then read Charles, and he's talking about seagrass meadows coming back on the south coast as well, and the enormous impact it could have in mitigating climate change. And I didn't know about it, and you can get really quite evangelical because you're like,
and
all
they're so
the little
accessible.
things we're doing. If we could protect our seagrass, which is relatively simple, not trawling, we could do a lot of good. So that's so great to find some positive stories in there. And I love the writing as well. Did you tell me a bit more about your background? Because the writing's really enthusiastic, quite, I guess, quite informal. There's a few mentions of the Kardashians in there, which I didn't really get. But it really made me laugh out loud. But then there's a lot of research underneath. And did you feel that you had to do that to bring a young audience in, or was that you just naturally how you write?
I think, well, in time I realised it was just how it came more easily to me. So being commissioned to write a book about climate change is exciting but incredibly intimidating. And especially when I don't come from a climate change background, I just come from a place of an experience of living a life that is affected by climate change and is going to continue to be affected by climate change. So that's my only perspective, as being someone in their 20s who is in that world, but not an expert. But I can translate research into a way that is easy for me to understand. So I tried to write at the start, how other writers wrote about nonfiction, clever people who I really admire and other authors. And I was finding it such hard work. And it was my editor who was like, you're trying too hard here to be someone else. We wanted you and your voice and your perspective, so just write it how you'd say it. And so upon taking that approach, it then it's not a stream of consciousness, but it is informal, it is chatty, and I wanted the reader to just feel like they had a friend through this whole story.
Yeah.
And kind of breaking down the fourth wall a little bit and having those little asides just to break up the heaviness of it, because it is frightening.
Yeah.
And I almost needed to write like that to help me remain in a good place with clarity so that I could report the stories in the best way possible to have impact and not get too bogged down in the gloominess, sort of have a break from the science. Where are we on the journey? Have I fallen off my bike? Probably. Am I hungry? Definitely. That sort of thing. So just to try and add a bit of humanity back into an ultimately human
And it does work. You're really taking long. But Sophie, you are a bit of an expert. Like, you did a lot of research, and it is a clever book because it is informal. But there's some really beautiful writing here, like a couple of descriptions I really remember, like ravens above your head in a tree sounding like clearing up dinner plates. And I was immediately like, yes, so there's some lovely descriptions. So it makes it just as nicely written and serious a book to be young and feminine writing it, and I think that's really good. And you talked about bringing the personal in, and I really enjoyed that, and I really felt that you did that in the chapter on Atlantic salmon, which has got a hairy bit, which I won't give away, but I was quite shaken by it.
Me too.
Yes. But you start talking about change, and, like in your own life, as a child, being affected by change in your family dynamic, and how difficult we all find change, and that's essentially what's happening to the climate, and I've really found that quite moving. How we're all sort of sticking our heads in the sand.
It's the hardest thing to do.
It's really
to
hard.
Accept what's going on.
Yes.
And it's because we're being asked to accept monumental change.
Yeah.
And it is really hard.
Yeah. and then there's all those species like the mountain hare, that lovely description of, like, you've got a beautiful fur coat for the season, but you're wearing it the wrong season, and the claustrophobia of that. That was quite a moving moment. You think, and the phenology, all the I think it's a problem with many of the species you talk about, like I think the bilberry, the bumblebee, which needs to mate at the right time for the flowers and stuff. So change is a big issue. And do you think that your generation, like millennials, 18 to 35, we were talking about, do you think your generation, how do you feel you're processing that change? Do you feel like they're really, because it's a tricky one for me, because in some ways you think this generation don't care. But in other ways, there are people, super gluing themselves to the M25. Like, how do you think your generation is coping with the change?
I think we really do care, but I think our care is really unsupported. So we can't, people, all my friends, a lot of them are still living at home, trying to save money to buy a house. They've got life going on, they've got relationships, they've got work, they've got careers they're trying to forge. They've got everything happening at once. They're being pulled in a million directions.
Yeah.
But they are arguably at their most kind of agitated and fired up and wanting to learn about politics, wanting to engage, aware of what's going on, but then not knowing where to channel that. And so it starts to sort of be consuming. And so, yes, you might have some good conversations and see stuff on the news and be like, yeah, go there and they're doing great stuff. But on the whole, that's kind of where it ends. It's like sort of short term. It's hard to imagine a long-term sustainable adaptation at the moment that will be really... we need leadership in that direction. We don't have it, and it's really hard to feel like we're going to affect that change. But the more of us that stand up and question where information is coming from and do our research and everything, then the better. But I personally, I've never superglued myself to a road, and I don't feel inclined to, because that's not really my style. I'm a more introverted person and prefer to sort of go about things in other ways. But I think we ultimately are incredibly caring, and we've got a lot of worries that I think are burdening us, but it's just difficult to know it's often just easier to bury them and then say, we'll worry about them later.
There is fear in this book and sadness, and you cover it up with being quite jolly on the surface. But I did get that from the stories you were telling, and I'm kind of getting the impression from you, you're saying your generation, are worried about climate change, really understand it, but just don't know what to say or how to affect change. And I think you're quite effective at that, through your science communication, through this book. So what would you say to people of your generation to try and help them, make their voices heard, or to try and, I don't know, bring the leadership, or to make the changes that need to happen?
I think just going about it in your own way and not giving yourself a timeline or a deadline as to when you should find out who and what that is and what that looks like. Because otherwise you'll sort of do something and feel like you've got to be someone else and feel pressured to go down a certain route, and it might not be true to who you are and what's actually important to you. So I think, and that's not going to be long-lasting or sustainable, because it comes back to that emotion. And so if you are going to emotionally invest yourself in climate action and things, and you need to be in a really good place, sort of figuring out what that looks like for you and how does that suit your life and everything. But I think also practically exercise your right as a voter. It might seem sort of difficult at the moment to feel like that's going to make any difference, but MPs hold their surgeries, and you can go and make appointments and go and speak to them or write letters, and even just doing that and being part of that questioning can help sort of alleviate some burdens. But I think just talking about it and collaborating, and for me, positivity and hope is essential. There has to be hope, and there is. And having the privilege to speak to experts and scientists throughout all the different travels and chapters, and many of them just happen to be around my age, doing masters or PhDs, and
many women as well.
Many women, and realizing that there's a whole generation of scientists who are dedicating time and research and have funding to helping find solutions here. So actually, if you look for it, the solutions are happening. They just often don't get the airtime.
And I loved how in the book you're often like, I want to be like her.
I know.
There were these really
change
great
careers.
Yeah, there were these very inspiring figures who weren't, and a lot of them were young and female, and that was really nice to see. And I think some people, the younger people, reading the book might wonder how they can go down that line. Follow a similar path to you and being able to act on climate change and communicate science. So how did you get into it? How would you advise people who are interested to get into that field? I had quite a traditional route in that I did zoology at university.
Yeah. I did a master's in science communication after dithering about, not really knowing what I wanted to do, like lots of people. But science communication has suddenly become, in the last few years, a fascinating industry, and so needed to be that translator between science and the public, and sort of mediate data and facts and hypotheses and conclusions, and sort of say, okay, here, public, this is what you need to know. But what's lovely is that it's an opportunity to really merge disciplines between science and the arts. And I did English and science at A-level, and I loved English, and I was very nearly going to do English at university. But then I thought, well, English is something I can sort of carry on the side if I wanted to. but I wanted to do science. And so I think there's lots of different paths. I think it depends if you want to do practical conservation. You know, I volunteered for the Wildlife Trust for several years and kind of built up a sort of vision of what did conservation actually look like and how many different forms it takes. And then my day job is I work in comms for an NGO called Beaver Trust, so we're doing beaver restoration in rivers around Britain. And so that is desk-based conservation, but then with a practical focus. So, you know, we're living in a time where it's all hands on deck. And so basically, if you're vaguely interested in this, dip your toes into lots of different
Because you're an ambassador for the Wildlife Trust, aren't you?
And and then I work with the RSPB on their committee, and so they're all voluntary positions, but I'm just at a point where, and I end the book with this, where I've got more questions than answers, and so I'm on a fact-finding mission, and so to surround myself with people who know a lot more than I do, and who have amazing experience and wisdom to draw upon to help figure out what on earth we're going to do, is really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be in this industry. It can be turbulent, but also everything is turbulent.
And I think I was talking about your generation there, and I think the next generation is Generation Z, younger than yourself. What do you think? How do you think they can be brought on board or enthused to care and act on climate change?
When it's younger children, they need support from education systems. Parents need to be supported by education systems and local authorities and councils to have good green spaces and to advocate time outdoors and all that sort of stuff. So,
nature deficit. One of the questions I was thinking, I wanted to ask you was, do you think your generation, maybe the next generation, need nature more than ever because of, the experience in this book are so real, and a lot of people are stuck behind a screen.
Massively.
And so nature offers this a way of stimulating people, helping them get away from perhaps that track that might not serve them in the long run. Like, nature has a really important role.
Oh, for well-being, massively. And, how can we expect people to understand what's happening to nature and to take action for it if they don't know it? So that it comes back to the whole premise of this book is just helping us know nature more.
And I think
it's better.
A really interesting one is, you can see nature so clearly, like on screen, like a David Attenborough, or there's so much social media, there's so much we've almost never had better access in terms of digital, but very few people would know how to go out and spot a bird or to really have proper engagement with nature, I suppose.
I mean, joining your local wildlife trust, for example, is a brilliant way to discover and get to know the nature on your doorstep. And they've got all sorts of free events that go on. They have work parties at weekends, which are really fun, and you just get to be around other people who care about those things and can sort of help nurture that interest a little bit.
And do you, we talked a little bit about this before, about social media, but I think it's quite an important one because, when we're doing a job like this, a talk or promoting a book, you can kind of go down a bit of a social media rabbit hole, and it's part of the promotion. But I'm always talking to your generation because I think you're better at actually limiting yourselves for well-being. Do you do that yourself with social media?
I studied social media actually for my master's dissertation. And how
can you study it?
Well, kind of.
I didn't know that.
Well, I sort of did. My dissertation was how can we use social media to communicate conservation messages and get people into the environment. So it's very much like a real-time experiment where I sort of tested out all those sorts of things. And I think then, because I've got that sort of analytical understanding as to what it actually is and how the algorithms work, and although they're changing all the time, I've always been quite skeptical of it. And so it can be a double-edged sword. It can be amazing for introducing you to a community of people who you would never otherwise meet, and to give you a platform to spread messages about climate and nature and how to help and all those sorts of things. It's unmatched. It's an amazing opportunity, but only if it's used sensibly, because it can perpetuate the feelings of helplessness and doom and gloom. It's a highlights reel. So it's good to open a few doors, but I think to take a little bit of a cynical approach can be quite healthy. So I've become better at keeping it at
you say in the book, social media has made me demanding, anxious, anxious and shorten my attention span to
Correct.
dangerously low levels. And I was like, oh yeah, I get that. And then, and that's in the introduction. And of course, sort of lying in some heather looking for a merlin for however many hours.
I don't have the patience.
But it's a way of teaching, bringing back that patience, and then the reward from seeing these animals and understanding the science. It is quite, I like that, the contrast of understanding how fast the world's going and the social media, but also understanding how nature is, in fact, going at a different pace.
It is. And
we might have time for one or two questions from the audience, if anyone's got any questions. In that case, I have one more question for Sophie, and it's the one that she ends the book with. Well,
no.
you ask, you sort of put the reader in a position and say, I'm going to put them both out there because I think they sort of work well together.
Yeah.
What do we want from the world, and what does the world want to be? So I'd like to ask you, what do you want from the world? What do we want?
What do we want from the world?
Yeah. And maybe just tell me why you thought it was so important to pose those questions at the end, because it was quite an interesting way to really quite punchy to end the book with those two questions. Was it to really force the reader to take action? Why did you want to end it like that?
I think because all the way through, understanding what's happening to these animals, and largely because of us, they're in this predicament, just left with asking why. Why have we ultimately done this? And why do we do stuff that we know is wrong and is detrimental? And why are we sort of in this paradox of harming nature to help ourselves, but we're harming ourselves by harming nature in this sort of, we are nature. And so in terms of what do we want from the world, I think for me it's just, as age old, but harmony, I think.
And I think you're answering, what does the world want to be? I think if we answer that question, you're aiming, if the world wants to be in harmony with nature, then you're trying to...
We need to be in a symbiosis with nature, and we couldn't be less so at the moment, but we just need to understand that if we help nature, we help ourselves. We help nature, we help ourselves, again and again. But maybe we'll get there.
Maybe we'll get there. Well, thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
And I do urge you to read the book. It's wonderful.
Thank you.